Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Jenner for Card Runners, and I'm here with Button and Blind Play Part 7, out of position play in 3-bet pots. So let's go over a quick outline for the video. I'm going to randomly generate a few flops and turns to allow us to analyze out of position 3-bet pot play. And if we play the flop well, the turn should be pretty easy to play on most turn cards, because if our flop check calling and our flop betting ranges are designed well, then we're already kind of had in mind what we're going to do on most turn cards. So hopefully if we do well on the flop, the turn shouldn't be too difficult. And keep in mind that the pot will usually be around 16 or 15 big blinds on the flop. So betting around 65% of the pot on all three streets will get all the money in by the river for 100 big blind stacks. So as mentioned earlier, min raises pre-flop mean the pot is smaller post-flop. And if we have a smaller pot post-flop, then of course we need to bet bigger on all three streets to get all the money in by the river. All right, so here's our 3-betting range. So let's get started. Boom. All right, so flop is the ace of diamonds, the queen of hearts, the 4 of diamonds. Total combos is 182. Okay. So let's start with sort of the obvious hands. And when we're dealing with 3-bet pots, we're going to be dealing with mixed strategies a lot. So, for example, ace-queen might need to be bet here sometimes and check raised to others. But when I say obvious hands, like, we're going to bet ace-king, I think. Ace-jack, I think, is going to be a bet 2. Ace-10 might be bet on the flop and check called later. So I'm actually going to put that here right now, but I might find out that's wrong. And then I think we're also going to bet most of our ace-x suited, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But again, if we bet these suited aces, I think we're betting them now, and we're going to be check calling them later. We're obviously not going to bet all three streets. But I'm considering these strong bets because they're usually ahead on the flop, and these are the type of hands that if we're betting them on the flop, we're going to at least check call one, if not multiple streets later. Whereas weak bets are going to be more of like our air. So check calls, I would say pocket kings. I'm going to go ahead and just check call that bad boy. And then I also want to check call my like queen x hands. So let's go back to talking about the ace x suited really briefly. I'm totally fine with check calling these hands on the flop. But we already have hands like king queen, which are functionally pretty much the same. They're very, very similar. So I'm just going to go ahead and check call the queen, king, queen, jack stuff, which is functionally very, very similar to the suited aces. And then the suited aces I'm probably going to bet on the flop and then check call them later. The other thing I want to keep in mind, and this is something that has been throwing me off the most when I do 3-bet pot play analysis, is I don't want my check calling range to become too transparent as being only medium strength hands. So I'm going to go ahead and keep listing the remaining queen x hands, but one thing that we're going to have to pay close attention to is our check calling range needs to not just be hands that like lose to random aces and beat everything else. Because if it is only composed of hands like that, then our range is just too transparent and it's too easy for our opponent to play accordingly. So let's also check call with a few really strong hands like ace-queen. And maybe let's check raise some ace-queen as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. We can actually check raise pocket queens. So let's say we check call with 4, or let's say even 5 of the ace-queens. And then let's say we bet 4 of them. We'll tweak this a little bit more in a minute. That might not be enough check raises. So let's see. All right. So let's first count how many hands we're sort of value betting. So that's going to be 12. I'm actually going to save the ace-queen here. That's 12, 24, 36, 39, 42, 45, 48, 51, 53. So betting with a range that's like capped at ace-king may not seem ideal, and it's probably not. But at the end of the day, there's not much our opponent can do to exploit us if our betting range is capped at ace-king. It's kind of like, well, he can have ace-queen, but ace-queen's going to be able to raise pretty much no matter what when we bet. So there's not a lot he can do if our betting range is capped at ace-king, though that still doesn't mean that's ideal. So this is the range that I made earlier on in the series, and the first video was made a couple months ago. So it's been quite a while. And as you remember, I was talking about 4-betting hands like ace-queen, which I still like, though in reality I think it might be a mixed strategy where ace-queen flat sometimes. It's hard to tell. But let's just assume we're playing against someone that calls 3 bets pretty wide. And I do think we can call 3 bets wider than here than I made in the first video. So let's say we widen this range out a little bit and we make it something like that. And then let's also assume this person calls with ace-queen off but not ace-queen suited. So I'm just going to store this range as like, another button 3-bet flat. It's not the range we made earlier, but again, we don't know what the optimal range here is. So, given this range, if we had a hand like ace-king, we would only be beat on the flop like 3.3% of the time. So, after having looked at the range, even if we give our opponent ace-queens, I'm surprised to see just like how rarely ace-kings beat. Because I'll be honest, if I 3-bet pre-flop and my opponent calls with this range and I have ace-king, I immediately think to myself, oh man, my opponent might have ace-queen. And, you know, if it was like a middle position opened and we 3-bet from the blinds, then ace-queen would probably make up a much greater fraction of his range. But for button versus big blind play, as people really start defending 3-bets aggressively in the button, like they probably should in theory, we're just not going to have ace-king beat very often here. So I have no problem with our flop betting range basically being capped at ace-king. I guess we have ace-4 suited here too, but it's not that big a deal. So we might be able to check call or check raise all the ace-queens. So I'm going to put the other ace-queen right here. Okay. All right, so now let's put in some of the weak bets. So we're probably going to bet like all the... We're probably going to bet like almost all, if not all, the gut shot stuff. Some of this could be check called too. So actually, I don't want to get ahead of myself. So let's pause on the king jack off for a minute. Let's stick with the most obvious hands. So let's say we're going to bluff with a hand like, I'm just going to say king 10 suited, even though that could be debated. 2. That's 4 combos, or 3 combos. We don't want to count the flush draw. Jack 10 suited is going to be 3 combos as well. We're not double counting the flush draw. 10-9 suited, let's say... That one's a little... I'm going to actually go ahead and put in all these hands right now, so let me just pause for a second. So I wrote a note up here, which is 65% pot size bets need to work 60% of the time to make an immediate profit. If the opponent calls 65% of the time on the flop, 65% on the turn, and 60% on the river, he defends about 25% of his entire range by calling down. So I talk about this a bunch in the 2+2 book and in other videos. It's just a model. It's just an estimate. But if we assume our opponent calls a little bit extra on the flop and turn, because when he does call, we get to see, the next street, then if he's calling at these frequencies, he defends 25% of his entire range. So if we bet flop, turn, and river against this range, and we can go back to the even wider range we were using, he's mostly going to end up defending top pair and better by calling down all 3 streets. If we use the original range, then he can fold some of his weakest aces. And it, of course, depends what the turn and river are. But as a general rule of thumb, our opponent will not call down with anything worse than his aces, and he's probably going to even be able to fold some of the aces by the river. So I've added in some combos to the range. And one thing I want to point out is it seems like this is a board that's pretty hard to bluff on. Because the good bluffs that we have are hands like king jack, some backdoor flush stuff, but there's not that many bluffs. Like, really look at this range, and you'll probably notice there aren't that many good but not great hands to bluff with. So the bluffs are usually either like terrible, like 9-7 of spades, for example, would be an awful, awful, awful bluff, or they're like really good, like 6-5 of hearts, or a hand like king jack off. There's not a lot that's in the middle, which is like, yeah, it's an okay but not great bluff. So that's making it a little bit tricky to design these ranges. And what else is making it tricky is we have a lot of hands in our flop betting range that aren't going to want to bet all 3 streets. So, maybe we can bet all 3 streets with ace-10 or ace-9, but honestly, I still kind of doubt it, because I think what's going to end up happening is our opponent has too many ace-10 off hands for us to bet all 3 streets with ace-9. And in reality, even though, we're only looking at the ace-queen-4 board, if we randomly generate a turn and randomly generate a river, it's pretty unlikely our opponent doesn't improve some hands in his range. Like, even here on a turn 2 jack-river, our opponent's going to be able to start mucking, like, his weak ace-x hands because the jack gave our opponent, queen-jack hands and stuff. Or our opponent can maybe start value-raising some, like, well, on this river, he might still have a few king-10, and then he can value-raise his king-10s and balance it with some bluffs. So, because of that, even though on the flop it looks like we can bet aggressively with these hands, I don't think we're usually going to be able to bet all 3 streets. Sometimes we will bet all 3 streets with these hands, but not usually. And these hands almost certainly can't bet all 3 streets. So, because of that, we know these hands need a check call later, and because of that, we need to, bluff less. In other words, a hand like ace-king, 12 combos of ace-king will allow us to bluff significantly more than 12 combos of ace-10, or especially 12 combinations of ace-rag, because these hands just aren't going to be able to bet multiple streets at a high frequency. So it's hard to know exactly how many bluffs we should have. Right here I have 28, and I don't think that's going to be enough. And we're going to randomly generate a turn after this, so don't worry. And we can always work backwards. But I don't think that's going to be enough, because on the turn, I think we're still mostly going to want to bet these hands. And I think 28 bluffs will be a little bit too few. So I think ace 10, for example, wants to go bet, check, call. Ace 9 suited maybe 2, whereas these aces, I think, are going to start check calling on the turn. And I know I'm grouping ace 4 suited, which is 2 pair with these. I should just move this. All right, let's move that. Let's move that bad boy to the front. All right. So I know and I know the weaker ace X's are just gonna check on the turn. So right now, my general plan, I guess I should say, is these hands are betting all 3 streets usually, or hopefully. These hands are usually going to bet 2 streets, and these hands are usually going to bet 1 street for value. So it's really hard to model how many bluffs exactly we need here, but I think this is going to be slightly too few. So I'm still looking for a few bluffs here. And then if you'll notice, I've got my check raising range right now, and we've got queens and ace queen being check raised for value. Not that many bluffs, because the pot's so big, we're not allowed that many bluffs. Most of our check raises need to be pretty strong. And then I have our, draw check raises. So these hands right here actually can double barrel pretty well, meaning if we check raise bluff 6-5 of hearts, it's pretty easy to see what turn cards we want to ship on and what turn cards we want to check fold. So I think that's pretty cool. And then I'm just check calling some ace queens because I don't want our check calling range to be composed of only medium strength hands. And likewise, I'm also trying to check call some hands which can be bluffed later when they don't improve, like Jack 10, 10, 9, and King Jack. So if we do check call on the flop with this range, we have some hands that are going to be value betting later and some hands that can be bluffed later. But mostly when we check call with this range, we're doing that, hoping our opponent doesn't keep showing aggression and he, checks back and we can win with our pocket kings. Lastly, keep in mind, when we do check on this flop, even though it might feel like, when we check call, our range is kind of weak, even if we do have 5 ace queens, we're not always defending by check calling. So if our opponent wants to bet on the flop with a hand like ace 6, that's pretty risky because, if we check call, he's probably in pretty good shape because ace 6 mostly owns this range. We've only got a little bit of ace queen. But if we check raise, then he's the one who's got ants at his picnic because our check raising range is designed to make him just indifferent with his ace X. So a lot of things are going on here. I hope it's not coming off as a ramble, but that's what happens when we're dealing with actual ranges on complex boards rather than illustrating concepts cleanly in, a PowerPoint video. So right now, this is what I got. I'm going to plug in some more numbers and we'll talk a little bit more. Okay. So I put in the rest of the hands in different ranges here. And if you'll take a moment to look, and I'm going to encourage you to pause after I stop talking for a minute, I have us betting 99 combos for 54.3%, and then the total checks we're defending are these hands right here, which comes out to be 74.6% of all of our checks, because I was checking 83 combos on the flop, and then I was defending 62. So this was kind of my first run-through. And you'll notice, if I were to say, okay, if I were to play this range against you, if I were to play, my hands in this way, what would be the counter strategy? And I would say, don't bluff against me on the flop when I check to you. Because I'm defending my checks too aggressively. I'm defending 75% of my checks, and I'm defending by check raising, I think that's going to be give or take 15% of the time. So I'm also check raising pretty aggressively. So my first run through wasn't the best range. Of course, really, really good players are going to be able to, off the top of their head, make better ranges than I can. So even if you understand the methodology behind what I teach, a lot of time and practice really has to go into this to be able to do it on the fly really, really quickly. Anyways, I would pause for a moment, and I think you're going to notice if you pause, every hand I've put into different ranges will seem like it makes sense. So even though something I would imagine almost everyone that watches this video bets Jack 10 of diamonds, 10 9 of diamonds, and King Jack. They don't check call them. But notice if we don't check call them, what can we be bluffing with later when we value bet ace queen? And also notice that we can bet almost all these hands in our check raising range, but then we're not check raising on the flop, and that doesn't seem good on a board that's this wet. Check raising can be very, very effective, especially if we're not afraid to bet big if the flop checks through. So anyways, the reason why I'm encouraging you to pause here is I think you're going to look at this board and you're going to say you're going to see the only hands I'm really folding, like check folding on the flop, are like really crappy hands like 9-7 of spades, which are probably hands you don't really want to bet or check call or check raise with. Yet even though I'm putting hands into what look like reasonable ranges, overall it doesn't seem that balanced here because we're defending too many checks, which means some of the hands we're check raising or check calling we probably should be betting with. And it's not going to be a particularly easy thing to solve. So pause for a moment and think about how would you fix this range? And let's be honest, if you played a range like this, you'd probably do really, really good against the vast majority of people, but we can still do better. And when we're, doing work away from the tables, we want to get really, really good, because even if we write down all the combos now, we're not going to implement it perfectly when we're actually playing. So pause for a moment and think what you would do to change this range and make it better. So hopefully you've paused, and now I'm going to just talk a little bit more. I want to bet a little bit more aggressively than I have, and I want to defend a few less of my checks. So I still like check raising pretty aggressively here. But one thing I would say we can do is let's say we take these pocket kings and we start betting them on the flop. I'm going to call them a strong bet, but honestly, if we bet them on the flop and check call the turn, we're going to muck the river. But let's call that a strong bet. We'll make this 105, and we'll have to redo the percentage in a minute. So now we're betting a little bit more aggressively on the flop, and we have more hands that can check call on the turn. So, maybe again, these hands are betting 3 streets for value, these hands are betting 2 streets for value, and these hands are betting sort of 1 street for value. So that looks fine to me. I'm okay with betting kings on this flop. Do the hands work well as a check call? Of course. That's why I put them in the check calling range to begin with. But then I found out, you know what? Even though kings work well as a check call, so does all this fun stuff, and I really don't need that much. So do pocket jacks. Again, I'm just kind of moving stuff around a little bit to make it a little bit easier visually. Another thing that I did, which I probably should have mentioned before, is I decided to bet with 10s on the flop as a weak bet. So we're probably betting 10s on the flop to check fold the turn. And I think that can be okay. Our opponent might call on the flop with a hand like pocket 9s that we beat. We can always decide to keep bluffing with our hand if we turn a jack or a king. Maybe we want to bluff with pocket 10s because it's a gut shot at that point. Or, sometimes we'll just get lucky and straight up spike the 10. But this is definitely a hand that I don't feel good about betting, but I don't really want to check call with it either. And I don't think it's all that likely that our opponent checks down. It's pretty hard, honestly, to win at showdown with 10s without having to call 1 or 2 bets. And I don't think it's something we really want to do. It's also pretty susceptible to being outdrawn by the opponent, just by random kings and jacks. So I guess what I'm ranting about here is I don't think there's really a very effective way to play pocket 10s. I don't like check calling it. I don't like check raising it. I don't like check folding it. I don't like betting it. I don't really like any of them. But we got to do something with it. And since I'm having so many trouble finding just even remotely reasonable bluffs here, notice this would actually be probably easier if it was rainbow, because then I could feel better about betting all of my suited connectors and stuff as a 3 to a flush type hand. A hand like 9-7 of spades I think is a lot better to bet when we have a backdoor flush draw. And also, on this board our flush draws are pretty strong. So here we only really have hearts. We only have 9-7 of hearts for a backdoor flush draw hand. So it's just harder to have bluffs. Okay, done with that little mini rant. So we've added kings to the flop betting range. No, we're no longer check calling with them. So let's count how many combos we have here now. 17, 29, 32, 38, 39, 40, 43. Okay. We maybe can also check raise a little bit less. And this is what I kind of hate about doing when I do 3-bet pot analysis is it's very possible that ace-queen is a mixed strategy to the point where we bet some on the flop, we check call some on the flop, we check raise some. Because if we find out we're check raising a little bit too much, well, one of the easy things we can do is we can just say, okay, well, let's just check raise less ace-queen now. So let's just move, 2 ace-queen up here, no big deal. So now we're value betting a few more really strong hands. And then we'll also move, let's say, it's a rough estimate. This really isn't perfect here. But let's say we're just going to move one of our bluffs into the weak betting range. A very small change, but it lowers how aggressively we're defending our checks and allows us to bet more aggressively. So I'm going to do my best not to rant about this too much during videos, though I'm sure I will rant about it at least a little bit more. In 3-bet pots, and especially 4-bet pots, you really see a lot of mixed strategies, I think, because you just have hands that make up such a large fraction of your range, and you find out if you always do the same thing with that hand, you can't get the ranges to balance as nicely as you'd like. So ace queen seems like it can check call here, it can check raise here, or it can bet here. And if someone were to ask me, do you think if you always bet ace queen, is it exploitable? I imagine it could be. If you always check raise ace queen, is it exploitable? I imagine it probably is. And if you always check call ace queen, is it exploitable? I imagine it probably is. So in other words, if your opponent knows you're always doing the same thing with ace queen, there might be a counter strategy he can take. Like, especially if you're always check raising with ace queen, you might just be check raising way too aggressively. So because of that, you see me have, 5 ace queen that I'm check calling with, 2 I'm check raising, 2 I'm betting with. And this also kind of means that if I was reviewing my own play or someone else's play, and I saw, hey, this guy always, this guy check called with ace queen on the flop, or I check raised it, or, we took any one of those 3 lines, I'd probably be okay with it. I don't have, it seems like a reasonable mixed strategy, so any line you take is probably fine. So that's also a good thing to note, where if you have a read on your opponent, one of those lines might be best, and even in theory, all 3 are probably fine. Okay, so I recalculated the percentages, and now we're betting here a bit more often on the flop, almost 60%, and we're defending about 72% of our checks. These seem like more reasonable frequencies to me, but if I had to guess, we should still be betting the flop a little bit more aggressively and maybe defending a little bit less of our checks. So it's hard to tell exactly where to move these ranges now, because I do think they look better. And all these hands that we're check calling with look like pretty reasonable check calls. Again, maybe we can move a few more of the of the ace queen hands to the betting range. I'm just going to go ahead and do that really quickly. And we can maybe move a few of the, that's the problem, we don't really have that many bluffs here. Like, there just aren't really that many bluffs. And I do like the fact that we have these, king jacks and flush draws that can be bluffed later. I guess we can turn pocket jacks into a bluff if we need to after check calling it on the flop. Because also when we check jacks on the flop, we don't know our opponent's going to bet. So we could just check jacks on the flop and end up checking all the way down and winning. So it's possible if we do check call with the flop with jacks, we should bluff it later. Again, this gets very detailed, but in a vacuum, I really like these ranges a lot. And what I mean by that is I don't see any hand that's in any range where I go, ew, gross. Whereas if I were to look at the ranges I made 4 or 5 years ago, I was probably bad enough at poker then that I would constantly be putting hands in ranges where they don't really work that well. Whereas I don't think that's happening here. It's more of just we need to make sure that our frequencies seem reasonable, and we have so many hands that are so similar. As I keep pointing out, just all these hands, queen, king, queen, jack, queen 10, jacks, even pocket kings and ace 2 suited are all very similar in hand strength, so we need to put them in different ranges, even though it's not going to be a big mistake if you check call the flop with ace 2. You see that happen pretty often, and pretty good players take that line pretty regularly. Okay, so I already added that up here, so I'll change the frequencies real quick. Okay, I've changed the frequencies. They didn't change that much, but again, now we're defending a few less checks, and we're betting a little bit more aggressively. So what's really important, I think, is to always talk about, your thoughts or, analysis after you do something like this. So here I would say, I was surprised to see how strong the 3-betting range was on this flop and how easy it is to check call too many marginal strength hands. We have a ton of hands like, ace 2 suited, pocket kings, queen king, queen 10, that are all similar hand strength. And we must be careful not to check call so many that our range becomes, our check calling range becomes transparent. Whoa, typing's hard. Our check calling range becomes too transparent towards marginal strength hands. I think it's best to bet the king, king, ace 5 suited type hands, which can get value from our opponent's queen X hands, and then check call with our queen X hands, and then check call with our queen X hands and protect, I'll even put that in parentheses, protect that range with some slow played ace queen. Okay, so yeah, so there's the range. And we're going to analyze it on the turn. I don't think we're going to go to the river, but we should have a good sense of what will happen on the river after we do the turn. But I want to look to see if, I want to look to see how our betting range did on the flop. I want to look to see how our flop betting range does on the turn, so we're going to talk about what kind of hands we bet and what kind of hands we check on the turn. The other thing I wanted to quickly point out is if you look at this flop check calling range, and again, we're check raising on the flop too. So our opponent, when he bets on the flop with a hand like ace X, he's got to be afraid of getting check raised. But if we do check call, we still have some hands that can check raise on the turn against a bet, a hand like ace queen or some draws, and that makes a nice balanced range. And then if we do check call twice, I don't mind so much if our range is capped on the river. So let's make it really extreme. Imagine our range was capped on the river at king queen, but our opponent only had like a 60% pot size bet left. Yeah, it's not ideal to be in that position. We'd rather not be there. But by the same token, there's only one street left and stacks are shallow, so it's not that bad to be there with a capped range. Whereas obviously if we had a capped range on the flop, and a lot of stack depth, that'd be terrible. I'm not really that afraid of having a capped range on the river in a 3-bet pot when there's not much stack depth. So just keep that in mind, and if we did find our range was too vulnerable on the turn, then we'd now probably go back to check calling a few more strong hands, and we'd move them from either the betting range or the check raising range. All right, so let's randomly generate that flop. We've got the turn locked in Flopzilla, and push. All right, 2 of diamonds on the turn. So right off the bat, I don't think there's any removal effect to that hand. Yeah, there's no hands we bet on the flop that have the 2 of diamonds. So we still are going to have all 110 combos. And just right off the bat, you can already tell that this is a turn card that really changed the strength of a lot of hands in our range. And it's very normal to get a turn card that brings the flush or brings the straight. So we're going to go ahead and do the analysis on this turn. All right, so what I did was I cut and paste the hands we bet with on the previous street and moved them just above where I wrote down the board. So that way I just can see all the hands that are in my betting range. In my range on the turn. And notice that since we have no removal effect, we're still going to have all 12 flush draw combos that we bet on the flop. So I decided to bet 10 of those on the turn and then check raise 2. The other thing I want to point out is I'm going to use these same board textures in my next video when I talk about how the button should respond when facing a bet or facing a check. But just know that you kind of have to start somewhere. And what I mean by that is it's hard for us to know how we should play our range on the turn unless we know how the button's defending against a bet on the turn, or how he's playing against a check on the turn. But it's hard for us to know what the button should do when facing a turn bet unless we know what the big blind turn betting range is. So you kind of just have to start somewhere and work back and forth, and the better you get, the better your first guess will be. But it's very possible that, we're off a little bit here and we're betting the turn too wide, or we're not betting the turn aggressively enough, and we'll probably find that out in the next video. So I can look at the button's range, and this is his range if he had, if he called 100% of the time on the flop. But of course, he probably raised some of his good hands and folded his weakest hands. And because of that, we don't know exactly what his range looks like. But if he did call with everything, he'd have 2-pair or better, 17%. If we had ace king, that wouldn't change that much. It'd go down to 16.9%. And so to be honest, ace king's going to be beaten a decent amount of time here because the button's folding his weakest hands on the flop, and even though he's probably raising some ace queen, he's probably still calling with a lot of them. So ace king's going to be a reasonably thin bet on the turn and river, I think. If we bet the turn and river, I don't think the opponent's going to have to call down much weaker than ace jack. But I do think we're still going to be able to probably bet the turn and river with ace king, so I wrote that down there. Again, we might find out that's wrong in a bit, and we'll have to change our strategy. I'm also going to say we bet the 4 ace queen and the 4 ace 4 and the 3 ace 4 suited combos, and I think this will make up most of our betting range on the turn. So I don't think we're betting crazy aggressively here because a lot of the hands that we were planning on betting for 2 or 3, I'm trying to think if I still want to bet like ace 10 or ace jack for one street here. And I think I do because I want some hands that are going to bet flop, bet turn, and then check on the river and probably check call. So I'm going to use ace jack as those hands, and we'll try to see later if that's right. I also noticed we can bet ace 2, so I put that in the betting range, whereas I'm check calling with all the other aces, and at least the kings with a diamond, and we'll see about kings without a diamond. All right, so let's go back to looking at all of our weak bets, and I think we're going to want to bet with most of our naked diamonds. So king jack, let's put that in the betting range. Some of these are obviously going to be a lot better than others if they have the flush draw. What else? It's kind of hard for us to have just the naked flush draw here. Let's look at that big blind 3-bet. Yeah, because the offsuit stuff usually either made a pair. Yeah, all the offsuit stuff other than King Jack made a pair with either the ace or the queen. So it's hard for us to have many naked diamonds here. So that's something that's pretty useful to notice. Like, this looks like a spot where it's going to be kind of hard for us to find bluffs on the turn because we just don't have naked diamonds. So that's something that's kind of neat to note when you're actually playing, because you're, of course, playing against non-optimal opponents. So if you're in the button and you're facing a double barrel here, maybe your opponent's too weighted towards value because he might freeze up and not know what to do with a lot of hands like ace-jack and ace-10 and end up betting with them. And also, he might not be bluffing enough because he just doesn't have obvious bluffs. Like, there just aren't naked... People look, I think, for a naked diamond here to bluff without thinking it's really hard to have a naked diamond. So here you can see we're betting 45 strong hand combos total. And I just worked out the math for it. And if we bet around 65% of the pot on the turn, we need to bet on the river or check with the better hand about 72% of the time combined to make our opponent indifferent to calling with a bluff catcher. I'll say that one more time. If we bet around 65% of the pot on the turn, our opponent is getting good enough odds that we need to either check with the better hand or bet on the river 72% of the time combined to keep our opponent indifferent to calling. Now, since it's a 3-bet pot and there's not much stack depth, there aren't a ton of implied odds because there can't be that much money that goes in on the river. But of course, this isn't going to model perfectly because in a real poker situation like this, on a very dynamic board, there's no such thing as like a pure bluff catcher. All of our opponent's hands can improve. But it's still useful to me to give us a rough idea about how aggressively we want to be bluffing on the turn and, of course, on the river. So let's just quickly sort of tally it up. Let's imagine on the river we don't really check any really strong hands. It's probably okay to not check any really strong hands on the river since, there's not a lot of stack depth. And if we're planning on betting these hands on the river, that's going to be 22, 26, 29, 32 combos. So if we bet 32 combos on the river for value, we'll probably need around 12 bluffs on the river. And then we're also going to be bluffing with some hands on the turn that aren't going to follow through on the river. So I would say, I'm just guessing here, but if we want, let's say we're going to follow through with our bluff with like our king jacks or something like that, and then we would need another maybe, 10 or 12 bluffs that bet the turn but don't follow through on the river. Now, that's probably not super precise. I mean, I may have gotten lucky, and that actually is really, really close to almost exactly what it is. But that's just sort of a rough estimate off the top of my head. So either way, I know I'm going to want some more weak bets here because right now I think I'm only betting enough bluffs that I would have to always follow through on the river with all of my bluffs. And I need some hands to kind of check fold, I think. So I know I need to pick up some more bluffs, and it's just really hard to find bluffs here, as I've already mentioned. So let's see what we can find. We have Jack 10 suited. Actually, I lied. Jack 10 suited will work. That's only 2 combos, though. Oof. Oh, wait, that's 3 combos. Nice. All right, what else do we have? We have Jack 10 suited. Do we have King 10 suited? We do. All right, so we have King 10 suited, too. So that's another 3. And I would like to find, like, another 3, but that just might not be practical. Maybe we could be like the 10s with the diamond. I like that. So let's do that. Let's say we're going to use these 9 additional bluffs. So we have 21 bluffs on the turn and 45 strong bets. But again, not all these strong bets are going to bet turn and river. At least ace-jack, I think, is going to need to check the river. All right, so that makes our total combos bet 66, in which case we're betting on the turn exactly 60% of the time. And a turn double barrel frequency of 60% is pretty normal, but I'm nowhere near sure that that's right in this case because this turn done changed the game. Like, this turn puts a lot of flushes in our range and a lot of flushes in our opponent's flatting range. Both, I know I'm going back and forth between the range that I made at the beginning of the video and now an even wider one. But whatever range you make the button cold call with, the turn's going to give them a lot of flushes. So it's even possible that we shouldn't be betting all of our ace-king and all of our ace-jack on the turn. I really don't know. All right, so we're check raising 2 flush draws. I'm not going to bother finding the one bluff, but you should check raise like one random bluff. And then that's going to be 3 combos we check raise, and then let's see how many check calls we had. Let's start off with trying just the diamonds of the kings. So let's see, that's going to be ace 10, ace 9, that's 15, 18, 21, 24, 27. So that's 27 total, so that's 30 combos that we're defending after checking, and we're checking how many combos? 110 minus 66 equals that. So 30 divided by 44. All right, so we're defending 68% of our checks. So we're defending a lot of our checks here, and we're also betting reasonably aggressively. So right off the bat, even though I don't know for sure, now I'm thinking we're betting the turn a little bit too aggressively. So what maybe should happen is maybe ace-king gets bet on flop and turn and then check calls river, whereas ace-jack might go ahead and start check calling on the flop. And the other thing we can do is if we want to protect our turn check calling range a little bit more, like this range right here is pretty transparent. But again, I care less here because there's just not going to be that much stack depth on the river and there's only one street left to act. But nevertheless, you know, when we're looking at all of our hands like this, we really want to ask ourselves, okay, if our opponent was playing like this, what do you think the counter strategy would be in the button? And here at a glance, I think the big blind's betting so aggressively and defending his checks so aggressively that the button's counter strategy would probably be to overall play a little bit too tight. Optimal Poker is very aggressive, so it doesn't blow my mind that, you know, it wouldn't blow my mind if Optimal Poker has a, you know, high turn bet frequency and a high turn check defending frequency. But I think this is still a little bit much. So what I think we can do is we can either bet a little bit less or we can check call a little bit less. So I'm going to see if there's any hands I think we can take out here. My guess is it's probably okay to just start mucking like ace-5 and ace-3 on the turn. Like we just don't need those hands, and kings with a diamond just do a better job. So let's move that down to 21. And then now we have 24 divided by, what was it? We had 54 combos. 24 divided by 54 is 44%. Is that right? No, it was 24 divided by 44. I'm sorry. 24 divided by 44. So that's, now we're defending 55%. So now, once we check for our opponent, we're letting him profitably bluff with any two cards, but he probably should get sort of rewarded for floating on the flop and getting a chance to bluff. Because we're not checking to him at a really high frequency, and we're still defending our turn checks pretty freaking aggressively. So this now looks more reasonable to me, just again at a glance. And if I was going to write some notes here, I'd write this. Okay. Oops. So I'm going to write the notes. You can hopefully remember the range. If not, go ahead and just pause the screen right here if you want to take a minute to like let it all sink in. But I would say this for the notes. My initial one thing I learned here is I need to get in the habit of check folding hands I was planning on check calling when I get an unfavorable turn. So next I wrote, it's great to have a plan on the flop, but there's a huge difference between a blank turn and a turn card that brings the flush, and I need to get more comfortable adjusting my ranges when the turn brings many flushes or straights. And I think this is a pretty common mistake people make, which is they go in kind of with a plan, and then when they get a turn card that's really difficult to know how to approach. So for example, if we have ace-king here, and we get that turn that brings the flush, it's too easy to sort of just stick with your original plan and not adjust it enough. And just like everyone else, I'm sure I do that too much as well. And I think the only way to really fix it is to sort of slow down and to actually, play with Flopzilla and analyze spots. Because when you're actually playing and you have 12 seconds to act, I really don't think it's very likely to make good decisions. You're very likely to make good decisions if you haven't really thought about the spot. Because at the end of the day, you're saying like, oh gosh, I have ace-king. What do I do if I check and he bets the turn in the river? Do I call it down? What is he really bluffing with if he does that? Do I bet on you have so many thoughts that are going on in your head at once that I think you too often just say, screw it, I'm going to bet. So the next thing I wrote is I need to see if it seems like a good idea to bet the turn in the river with ace-king, assuming the river blanks, though I imagine it's a mixed strategy. I'm really not sure. So to be honest, I think maybe we're betting the turn significantly too often here, but I'm not that confident in it yet because I haven't analyzed how I think the button should respond to, facing a bet on the flop, turn, and river, which I will do in the next video. And until I've analyzed how I think the button should respond when facing a flop, turn, and river bet, and that's a lot easier analysis to do than out of position play, to be honest. So until I've analyzed that spot, I'm not very confident that, this is a bet or this is a bet. It's possible we should just be checking a lot more on the turn and maybe check raising a little bit more aggressively as well to be a little more balanced. Now, for the sake of time, I don't want to go over the river in detail, but I just want to point out once more what I think will happen. My guess is that we're betting on the river with these hands mostly, although I'm really not sure about ace-king. So we're probably betting on the river with our flush draws, our ace-queen, our ace-4, and ace-2. We're going to be checking our ace-jack, and we're probably going to be betting some of our ace-king, but it's possible that's wrong. We maybe should check them all, or we maybe should bet them all. We'll look into that more in the next video. We're going to bluff the right amount of hands to balance out this betting range with all the flushes and then the 2 pair. And then we're going to be check folding some bluffs as well. Now, we also need to check call some hands, and our check calls are either going to be, the ace kings that we can have, we'll probably check call if we check them. And then we also probably should have some ace jack in our check calling range, but it's possible that even ace jack's going to be a mixed strategy where if we check call them all on the river, we're check calling too much, but if we if we never check call them, we're not check calling enough. So it's possible we should, bet flop and bet turn with ace-jack, and we're really hoping that when the river comes, if we check ace-jack, our opponent just checks back with, ace-jack or ace-10 and we win, and then if he does bet, we call some ace-jack and we fold some ace-jack. So just to go over it once more, these are probably the bluffs, like the king-jack. These are probably the check folds. Ace-jack's probably a mixed strategy where we maybe check call some and check fold some, and ace-king's maybe a mixed strategy where we bet some and check call some. You have to sort of get all that to balance out, but it's not something I would recommend you spend too much time worrying about. It's very detailed, and at the end of the day, hopefully this can make sense. All right, so let's randomly generate the next flop. Oh my gosh, 10-9-8 rainbow. I'm really tempted to not do this and just pretend I didn't randomly generate it using the magic of editing, but I'm going to try to do it because I do think this is an interesting spot. I mean, I'm just curious, and I think it's also one where we may find we maybe should be checking the majority of our range on this flop, since position's so valuable, and our opponent's gonna have a lot of really strong hands. Luckily, we can have Queen Jack too, which is a humongous deal here. All right, so total combos is gonna be 203. So since this board's so uncommon and it's unique in a lot of ways too, I'm actually going to get the help of PokerStove to see how equities overall change for ranges. So let's take this range and cut and paste it. And then let's take the button flat. And I do think this is too tight. I know it's the range that I made earlier, so I'm actually going to use the wider one here. Hopefully that's okay with you guys. I always kind of try to keep updating my videos and being honest when I think something can be improved. So hopefully you don't mind that I'm kind of switching the range a little. All I did was widen it a little. It's not that different. Okay, so in general, the range has the 3-betting range has 54% equity, and the 3-bet calling range has 46% equity. Let's see how it changed for this board. Let's see if the equity is a lot different. So we know on average the 3-betting range should have 54% equity, but here it has 49% equity. This is a bad flop because the 3-betting range has 5% less equity than it does on average, and position's super, super valuable here, and the button's going to have a lot of nut type or 2-pair hands. We will too, but the button has a lot. So this board sucks for our range. Okay. So I've talked in the past about how I kind of consider betting out of position a luxury, where it's you bet out of position when your range is good enough that if you were to check all your strong hands, your opponent's counter strategy would be for him to check back at a high frequency, since he knows you're going to be check raising and check calling a lot. So on that note, we don't donk bet out of the big blind when we call a min raise very often because our range is so much weaker than our opponent's. Well, here I think we're going to mostly have to check on the flop because our range has slightly less equity than the opponent's as the 3-better. And then the button has a lot of really premium hands, and he has position here, which is super valuable. So we might still have some betting range, but I think we're mostly going to be checking and defending our checks. All right, so the first thing I would do here, since I seriously have no idea how this range is supposed to look, I would start with saying okay, let's see how this range looks if we check our entire range. Let's just get crazy with it. That might even be the answer that we're supposed to check our entire range. But let's start with defending all of our checks. And then if our checking range gets too strong, then we'll start betting a little bit. Because it's possible here, and in fact, this would actually be my guess, maybe we should only bet on this flop 20 or 25% of the time. Because once we start betting more than that, our checking range gets too weak. I don't know, though. I'm not a super sick, awesome player, so we have to actually do the work to find out. All right, so check raises. Let's say we're going to check raise half the queen jacks. Let's say we check call half the queen jacks. Queen jacks. We can play it kind of loose. Let's check raise the 10s and 9s though. I don't really like giving free cards with those guys. I'm gonna go ahead. Oops. I'm gonna go ahead and check raise the top 2 pair too. That might be wrong, and there being 6 pocket 9s is definitely wrong, and 6 pocket 10s is definitely wrong. And Jesus, and this is 2 combos. Oh my gosh, it's falling apart because I know the flop's gonna be hard. Okay, let's see how often. I'm still using the wide range. Let's see how often. Oh my gosh, this guy's got straight 10% of the time. 2 pair, 14.5%. Whether or not we can check raise 10-9 suited is close. Let's see the removal effect here. Let's say we have 10. Let's say we had this. What's the removal effect? How often does our opponent have 2 pair beat? 12.1% of the time. Yeah, I think we can check raise it. We're definitely going to get shown better sometimes when we check raise. He'll definitely sometimes call with hands that have a lot of equity, but we're only beat on the flop 12.1% of the time after removal effects. And hey, it's a 3-bet pot. If I flop 2 pair and you flop a straight, I'm probably going to get stacked a lot of the time anyways, so I'd rather play this hand fast. So I think this is going to be the check raising range. I don't know if 10-8 suited also looks really close. It's not in our range though, so that makes that easy. I probably wouldn't check raise 9-8 suited. Let's see if we can look at that one. 9-8 suited is beats only 12.3% of the time too. Okay, I'm going to check raise 9-8 suited. I lied. So I'm check raising 2 pairs, sets, and half of the straight draws. And I probably have the really weak straight draws too. I probably check raise those as well. Sorry, not straight draws, the straights. I apologize for the kind of ranting while I type. I'm always trying to think ahead while talking, and I sometimes don't do that very well. Okay, so we're going to check raise the 7-6 suited too. So what really strong hands are we check calling with then? We're check calling with like queen jack, pocket aces. Let's even check raise. Let's check call with a few more queen jack actually. Let's check call with 12 queen jack to kind of protect this pretty wide check calling range. Then let's just put in everything else. Everything else that's just not going to want to check raise. I don't think we're going to check raise aces to jacks. That seems a little too aggro for my taste. Let's do. We're check calling with that. I actually should put in a separate check raise bluff spot here, which we'll do in a minute. So we're check calling with that. Let's see what our top pairs are. Using the power of Poker Stove, or sorry, Flopzilla, we have 21 top pairs. So I'm just going to write, actually I'll write them out. I'll go the extra mile. So that's 9 combos of King 10 suited to Jack 10 suited. Okay. Let's see how many 9s we got. We got middle pair, Ace 9 suited and 9-7 suited. Sure, let's throw them down there. Okay. So it's already looking like it's going to be a little harder to find hands than I was expecting. Let's look at the bottom pair. I mean, we got draws and stuff. We're definitely not done. I just mean, we're gonna start finding it harder to have. Again, there's me rambling while I type. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm gonna pause and then I'm gonna go ahead and write some more combos down. Okay, so I just wrote down some more hands that I think are pretty obvious, like Ace Jack, King Jack, and Ace Queen suited. And I actually think we can go like King Queen suited too for 3 combos. And that. I think King Queen off might make a pretty good check raise bluff, but we'll come back and see about that in a second. So King Queen off is going to be 13 combos. I'm counting the King Queen of diamonds, so anything without the backdoor flush draw is offsuit, as far as I'm concerned. All right, so let's count the good check raises. We had 10, 12, 14, 18, and then we're check raising 13, and that's probably a little bit too many bluffs there, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that down to 11 or so. It's a 3-bet pot. Stacked up's a hell of a thing. So we can't really check raise too many bluffs here, especially when our opponent's going to have so many hands with so much equity. So I think even 11 might be a bit much, but I'm going to go with that. For right now. So that this is our check raising range with our value up here and our bluffs down here and our value up here. And then let's see how many hands we had check called. I'll pause and tally it up. Okay. So I tallied it up, and we're check calling 107 combos, check raising 29, and defending 136 combos total, or 67% of our range. So that probably rings a bell, because if we defend 67% of the time, then our opponent doesn't make an immediate profit when he bets half pot on the flop, but he does, he does get to free roll a bunch of turn cards because he's already getting so much money from fold equity, and then we mostly defend by calling, and even when he's bluffing, our opponent can improve. So this looks pretty good at a glance to me, and I'll put it this way. I think that playing our range like this is probably way better than most people play their range when they just kind of like bet in this spot with a lot of random king 10, ace 10, pocket queen stuff because they don't know what to do with it. I think this strategy is actually significantly better. But I'm not convinced we shouldn't have any hands that are in our flop betting range. So like let's first look and see if there's any more hands we think we can defend that I missed. And I am trying to find those hands right now. So are there any hands that I'm trying to defend that I can defend that I missed? Because I'm defending all the pairs. I'm defending pretty much all the king queen. I'm defending pretty much all the ace queen. I'm not defending ace king suited. Maybe that's something we can defend with. So I'm going to keep a little mental note of that maybe we can defend ace king suited. In fact, I'll even put it in the check calling range right now. So the 3 combos there. Okay. But I'm not really seeing anything else. And if there is something obvious that I'm missing, I do apologize. But for the most part, this looks pretty reasonable to me. I don't really like the idea of defending 7-5 suited. It's pretty obvious why. It's drawing to a really freaking tainted straight on both ends. Like if the 6 comes, that's not really tainted, so I shouldn't say that. But at least on one end, if the turn card comes at jack, that's like the most tainted straight ever. So I don't really like defending 7-5 suited. So now the next question is this check defending range that we're using? So we're defending about 68% of our checks. I'm just going to round. We're defending about 68% of our checks now. Is our checking range so strong that our opponent's going to check back at a high frequency? And my guess is it's actually not. We are defending our checks pretty aggressively here, but our opponent's usually going to bet pretty small, especially because betting small lets him keep his positional advantage and makes our check raises less effective. So I think our opponent's going to bet pretty small, and defending with a range like this is actually quite good, I think. I like this more than betting, just trying to aggressively bet and not really defend our checks like I think most people do, as I already talked about. So while this range isn't perfect, let me tell you about the analysis I would write, if I had done this and was trying to improve my play. I would say something like, analysis. This board makes our range, our 3-betting range, go from having about 54% equity to 50% equity. In other words, this flop gives our 3-betting range 4% less equity than the average flop. Additionally, this flop is troublesome because it puts many nut-type hands into the opponent's range, and position is very, very valuable. So even though both the 3-betting and the 3-bet calling range have about 50% equity on the flop, the button seems to be in the more favorable position. And of course, when I say position here, I don't mean position in poker terms. I mean it in the more favorable, position or situation. So one other thing that you can do is you can look at both ranges and sort of just get a sense of how often they made really strong hands. So the big blind 3-bet made, 2 pair or better, 14.8%. The button 3-bet flat made 2 pair or better, 14.5%. Now, the button flatting range has significantly fewer overpairs than the big blind 3-betting range, but overpairs aren't that fantastic on this board. And overall, even if the big blind does have the slightly better range, and it probably does, being in position is such a big deal here that I think the button still overall is in the more, favorable situation. So what I would write is this next. I don't think in theory we should be checking 100% of our 3-betting range on the flop, but I imagine we should be checking very, very frequently. So if I had to guess right now, maybe we check 85% of the time and bet 15%. I'm not near good enough to worry about developing the 15% betting range, and instead would rather just recognize this is a flop that I should mostly be checking, that I should just say, not even mostly, that I should be checking as when I'm the 3-better. So in other words, what I'm saying is, if I had to guess, this range that we're checking is probably slightly too strong, just only a little bit too strong. And if I wanted to make my checking range weaker, then one thing I do is I start betting some of the hands, the strong hands that I'm check raising, betting some of the strong hands that I'm check calling, and then, also bet some bluffs. So in other words, I develop, a betting range even if I'm betting at a very low frequency. But this spot reminds me a lot of how I've talked about how I don't have a flatting range in the small blind when the button opens. And I talked about it earlier in this series. And it's not because I think, there's no way the small blind has a flatting range against a button open. If I had to guess, in theory, it probably does. But it's probably such a small range, and it's probably so hard to play and so hard to balance that I just think, hey, you know what? Any hand that can be flatted in the small blind also makes a pretty good 3-bet. I am personally not good enough to worry about developing and balancing a small blind flatting range against a button open. That's what I would say for this board too. Hey, this was a board that when I randomly generated it, I was kind of afraid of it. Not that I've never analyzed a board like this, but I know they're hard and they're tricky. But what I would actually just take from it is if I was really trying to make this practical for when I'm actually playing, I'd probably check my entire range on this flop. That I'm probably checking a little bit too much, but overall I think that's a much better strategy than betting aggressively. And just know that I think that strategy is good enough for me. I could probably come reasonably close to implementing this. It's not that hard to slow play some of our queen jacks, call with everything else that looks reasonable, and then, check raise, bluff our sets, our 2-pair, some of our straights, and then some bluffs. Like, this is something that I can reasonably implement, whereas if I were to start developing this small betting range and use a lot more mixed strategies, that's just beyond my skill level, so I'm not even going to bother doing that. So when you do this kind of analysis, I would encourage you to, not take the easy way out, but be realistic with what you can implement. Okay, so that wraps up this video. I'll try to use these boards in the next video when we're to the button. I'll at least use the Ace Queen 4 board, and I'll probably even use the really difficult 10-9-8 board. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it. I would encourage you, if you do decide to do this type of analysis, and this is the kind of stuff that I think the really good poker players I know are working on. By that I mean like people that have already pretty much gone through SSNL and are trying to win at MSNL. This is the kind of stuff they're doing, and I think it is really beneficial, but you can see it's time-consuming, it's a little bit mentally draining, and if you do this, don't make the mistake of trying to be overly anal or overly precise. That's not necessary. If you find that you're usually, c-betting on this board when you're the 3-better and not defending your checks, then that's already a huge improvement. You don't need to worry about getting all these, frequencies and ratios to line up perfectly. They're just estimates to begin with. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you took something from it. Let me know any questions or comments you have in the forums, and I'll look forward to doing the next video, which will be an easier one when we'll be in the button facing either bets or checks in 3-bet pots. So thanks for watching, guys. Good luck. Bye.